What happens when two of late-night television's biggest names collide in the most explosive confrontation ever caught on live television? You won't believe what unfolds when a simple guest appearance turns into a career-ending disaster that has the entire entertainment industry talking. Last night's episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live took a shocking turn that nobody saw coming, and the fallout is still reverberating through Hollywood this morning. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when civility completely breaks down between these two comedy giants. The stage was set for what should have been a routine promotional appearance. Seth Meyers, the sharp-witted host of Late Night with Seth Meyers, had crossed network lines to appear on Jimmy Kimmel's show in what was being billed as a rare collaboration between the two late-night powerhouses. The booking itself raised eyebrows in industry circles, given the notorious behind-the-scenes tensions that have simmered between various late-night hosts for years. But what started as professional courtesy quickly devolved into something far more sinister. From the moment Seth walked onto that stage, seasoned television observers could sense something was off. The usual warm embrace between host and guest felt forced, mechanical even. Jimmy's trademark grin seemed strained as he gestured for Seth to take his seat, and there was an unmistakable edge to his voice as he delivered what should have been standard welcoming banter. The studio audience, initially excited to see this crossover moment, began to pick up on the underlying tension that was crackling between the two men. The conversation began innocuously enough, with Jimmy launching into what appeared to be pre-planned questions about Seth's current projects and recent career milestones. But even these softball inquiries carried an undercurrent of something more pointed. Jimmy's tone had a sharpness that veteran talk show watchers recognized as the precursor to something bigger. Seth, for his part, seemed to be measuring his responses carefully, as if he knew he was walking through a minefield of potential confrontation. "So, Seth," Jimmy said, leaning back in his chair with that familiar smirk that his regular viewers know all too well, "you've been doing pretty well for yourself over at NBC. Must be nice having that network protection, right?" The question hung in the air for just a beat too long, and you could practically feel the temperature in the studio drop several degrees. Seth's eyebrows raised slightly, and his media-trained smile flickered for just an instant before he responded, with what seemed like forced levity. "Well, Jimmy, I think we're all just trying to do good television and serve our audiences," Seth replied, but there was a defensive quality to his voice that hadn't been there moments before. The veteran late-night host clearly recognized that this wasn't going to be the typical promotional appearance he had signed up for. Something was brewing beneath the surface, and both men seemed to be circling each other like prize fighters in the early rounds. Jimmy wasn't done probing. "That's interesting you mentioned serving audiences," he continued, his voice taking on a more pointed edge, "because I've been hearing some interesting things about ratings lately. Some people might say that certain shows are getting a little comfortable, maybe not pushing boundaries the way they used to." The implication was clear to anyone watching, and Seth's jaw tightened visibly as he processed what was essentially a thinly veiled attack on his show's performance and creative direction. The studio audience, initially caught up in the novelty of seeing these two late-night personalities together, began to sense that they were witnessing something more than just friendly professional banter. Conversations in the crowd grew quieter as people strained to catch every word of this increasingly tense exchange. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every micro-expression and subtle shift in body language as the two hosts engaged in what was becoming a very public game of verbal chess. Seth took a moment before responding, clearly calculating his next move. "Well, Jimmy, I think different shows serve different purposes. Some of us focus on political commentary and in-depth interviews, while others—" He paused meaningfully, letting his words hang in the air. "Prefer to stick to safer territory. Celebrity games, viral videos, that sort of thing." The shot was fired, and Jimmy's expression immediately darkened. The gloves were officially off now, and what had started as professional courtesy was rapidly transforming into something much more personal and pointed. Jimmy's legendary control over his show environment was being challenged right there on his own stage, and his reaction was swift and cutting. "Safer territory?" he repeated, his voice rising just enough to signal to everyone watching that the conversation had taken a definitive turn toward confrontation. But this was just the beginning of what would become one of the most talked-about moments in late-night television history, and the real fireworks were still to come. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted dramatically. What started as uncomfortable professional tension was now escalating into something far more dangerous. Jimmy's producers, watching from the control room, were frantically trying to decide whether to cut to commercial or let this train wreck continue to unfold in real time. The decision to keep rolling would prove to be one of the most consequential choices in late-night television history. "You know what, Seth?" Jimmy said, his voice dripping with barely contained hostility. "I think it's fascinating how some people in this business love to take the moral high ground, acting like they're doing something so much more important than everyone else." The studio audience could feel the shift in energy, and an uncomfortable silence began to settle over the room. This wasn't the Jimmy Kimmel they were used to seeing. The affable host who made everyone feel welcome was being replaced by something much more calculating and cruel. Seth's composure, which had been holding steady despite the mounting provocation, began to crack. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Jimmy, but if you have something specific to say, maybe you should just say it instead of dancing around it like this." His voice carried a warning that any reasonable person would have heeded, but Jimmy was far from reasonable at this point. The host was operating on pure ego and wounded pride, and he was about to make a decision that would haunt his career. Jimmy leaned forward in his chair, his famous smile transforming into something that looked more like a predator baring its teeth. "All right, Seth, since you want me to be direct, let's be direct. Your show has been struggling for months. Your ratings are in the toilet, your political commentary is preachy and out of touch, and frankly, I'm not sure why NBC keeps you around." The words hit like a physical blow, and you could actually hear several audience members gasp audibly. The camera operators, following their training to capture every moment of drama, zoomed in on Seth's face as he processed what had just happened. The color drained from his cheeks, and his hands, which had been resting casually on the chair's armrests, clenched into fists. For a moment it looked like he might actually stand up and walk away right then and there. But Seth Meyers hadn't survived in the cutthroat world of comedy and television by backing down from fights, and what happened next would prove that conclusively. "You want to talk about ratings, Jimmy?" Seth's voice was now ice cold, and the studio fell so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. "Let's talk about how your show has become a corporate sanitized shell of what it used to be. When was the last time you took a real risk? When was the last time you said something that actually mattered, instead of just playing it safe for your Disney overlords?" The mention of Disney, Jimmy's network parent company, was like throwing gasoline on an already raging fire. Jimmy's face flushed red, and his legendary media training seemed to abandon him completely. "At least I don't spend my entire show lecturing people about politics they don't want to hear about. At least I entertain people instead of making them feel guilty for existing." The personal nature of the attack crossed a line that neither man would be able to come back from, and everyone in that studio knew they were witnessing something that would have permanent consequences. The tension in the room was now so thick it was almost suffocating. Audience members were looking around at each other, unsure whether they should be cheering, booing, or simply sitting in stunned silence. Some were already pulling out their phones, sensing that they were witnessing a moment that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. The producers in the control room were having heated discussions about whether to intervene, but the train had already left the station. Seth stood up slowly, his 6-foot frame towering over Jimmy, who remained seated. "You know what, Jimmy? I came here tonight as a professional courtesy. I came here to support a colleague, and maybe give your audience something different. But clearly, you had other plans. His voice was steady now, but there was a fury burning behind his eyes that everyone could see. You want to make this personal? You want to air out grievances on live television? Fine. But don't expect me to sit here and smile while you take shots at my work and my integrity. Jimmy, perhaps realizing that he had pushed things too far, but unable to back down without losing face, doubled down on his attack. Your integrity? That's rich, Seth. You sit there night after night, pretending to be the voice of reason while you're really just another privileged comedian who thinks his opinions matter more than everyone else's. Your show isn't important. It's self-important. There's a difference. The words were designed to wound, and they found their mark. But what Jimmy didn't anticipate was that Seth Meyers, pushed to his absolute breaking point, was about to unleash something that would change everything. The look that crossed Seth's face in that moment was one that would be screenshot and memed across social media for weeks to come. It was the look of a man who had just decided that politeness and professional courtesy were luxuries he could no longer afford. The studio audience, sensing that something unprecedented was about to happen, collectively held its breath. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every second of what was about to become the most explosive moment in late-night television history. And in that moment of electric tension, with two careers hanging in the balance, Seth Meyers made a choice that would ensure this night would never be forgotten. You want to know what's really rich, Jimmy? Seth's voice cut through the studio like a blade, and his tone had shifted from defensive to something far more dangerous. Let's talk about integrity. Let's talk about how you've turned this show into a playground for your own petty jealousies and insecurities. The audience could barely believe what they were hearing as Seth began to systematically dismantle his host with surgical precision. Jimmy's face went from red to nearly purple, and his hands were visibly shaking as he gripped the arms of his chair. You don't know what you're talking about, Seth. You're embarrassing yourself. But even as he said it, his voice cracked slightly, betraying the fact that Seth's words were hitting far closer to home than he wanted to admit. Embarrassing myself? Seth let out a laugh that had no humor in it whatsoever. Jimmy, you just spent the last 10 minutes attacking my show, my ratings, and my character on live television because what? Because you're threatened? Because someone told you I was getting too much respect in the industry? The accusations were landing like hammer blows, and Jimmy's legendary composure was crumbling in real time. The control room was in absolute chaos. Producers were screaming conflicting instructions, some demanding they cut to commercial immediately while others insisted they keep rolling to capture what was clearly going to be a defining moment in television history. The decision to continue broadcasting this meltdown would have consequences that no one could have predicted. Seth took a step closer to Jimmy's desk, his voice dropping to a level that somehow made it even more menacing. You know what the real difference is between us, Jimmy? When I have a problem with someone, I don't ambush them on national television. I don't use my platform to settle personal scores. But you invited me here under false pretenses so you could take cheap shots at me in front of your audience. Jimmy finally stood up, perhaps realizing that remaining seated was making him look even more vulnerable. False pretenses? You came here to promote your failing show, and I'm just telling the truth about what everyone in this industry already knows. Your time is up, Seth. The network is just too polite to tell you. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, and for a moment it seemed like Seth might actually swing at his host. Instead, he did something far more devastating. He smiled, a cold, calculating smile that made everyone in the studio deeply uncomfortable. Is that what you think, Jimmy? That my time is up? He paused, letting the question sink in. Because I have to tell you, that's fascinating coming from someone whose show has been bleeding viewers to streaming platforms for the past 2 years. Jimmy's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He clearly hadn't expected Seth to come back with actual industry knowledge that cut to the heart of his own insecurities. That's not... The landscape is changing for everyone, he stammered, but the damage was already done. "The landscape is changing," Seth agreed, his voice now carrying the confidence of someone who had just gained the upper hand. "But some of us are adapting while others are clinging to outdated formats and wondering why their relevance is slipping away." The studio audience was now completely silent, riveted by this unprecedented display of professional warfare. Jimmy, desperate to regain control of the situation, made what would prove to be his fatal mistake. "At least I'm not desperate enough to come crawling to other networks begging for cross-promotion," he snarled, his media training completely abandoned. "At least I have some pride left." The accusation that Seth had somehow begged to be on the show was the last straw. Seth's entire demeanor changed in an instant, shifting from controlled anger to something far more dangerous. "Begging?" His voice was now barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than any shouting could have. "Jimmy, let me tell you exactly how this booking happened." What followed was a revelation that would rock the late-night television world to its core. Seth began to detail, with devastating accuracy, how Jimmy's people had repeatedly reached out to his representatives, how they had specifically requested this appearance as a way to boost Jimmy's show's credibility, and how the entire thing had been positioned as a favor to Jimmy's struggling ratings. "Your producer called mine 6 times, Seth continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. 6 times, Jimmy, begging us to do this appearance, telling us how much your show needed the boost of having a respected voice as a guest." The air quotes he made around respected voice were like a slap across Jimmy's face. Jimmy's world was collapsing around him, and everyone could see it happening in real time. His carefully constructed narrative about Seth being desperate for promotion was being systematically destroyed. And worse, it was happening in front of millions of viewers who would never forget what they were witnessing. That's not how it happened," Jimmy protested weakly, but his voice lacked any conviction. He knew that Seth had just exposed him completely, and there was no coming back from it. Seth straightened his tie with deliberate calm, a gesture that somehow made him look even more commanding in this moment of crisis. "You know what the saddest part is, Jimmy? I actually respected you once. I thought you were one of the good ones in this business, but tonight, you've shown everyone exactly who you really are." He paused, looking directly into the camera. "And they're not going to forget it." The studio was so quiet you could hear people breathing. Jimmy stood frozen behind his desk, looking like a man who had just watched his career implode in real time. The audience members were staring in stunned silence, phones recording every second of this unprecedented meltdown. And in that moment of absolute devastation, Seth Meyers prepared to deliver the final blow that would make this confrontation legendary. "You know what, Jimmy?" Seth's voice was now eerily calm, the kind of calm that comes right before a tornado touches down. "I'm going to do something for you that you clearly can't do for yourself. I'm going to show you what actual professionalism looks like." He turned toward the audience, his composure a stark contrast to Jimmy's visible panic. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize that you had to witness this. You came here for entertainment, not to watch someone's personal insecurities play out on live television." The audience began to murmur, some nodding in agreement while others remained frozen in shock. Jimmy, realizing that Seth was about to walk away with complete dignity while leaving him looking like a petulant child, made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Don't you dare try to spin this, Seth. Don't you dare try to make yourself look like the victim here." Seth slowly turned back to face his host, and the look in his eyes was one of pure contempt mixed with something that might have been pity. "Victim? Jimmy, I'm not the victim here. Your audience is. Your staff is. Everyone who believed in you and thought you were better than this. They're the victims." The words were delivered with such quiet intensity that they seemed to echo in the silence that followed. "You invited me here tonight not as a colleague, not as a fellow comedian, but as a target. You set this whole thing up as an ambush because what? Because you're insecure about your own relevance? Because you needed to tear someone else down to make yourself feel better? Seth's voice was gaining power with each word, and Jimmy was visibly shrinking behind his desk. The control room had given up trying to manage the situation. Producers were just watching in horrified fascination as one of the biggest disasters in live television history continued to unfold. Social media was already exploding with clips and reactions, and the hashtag Radio Kimmel Meltdown was trending worldwide before the segment had even ended. Jimmy made one final pathetic attempt to regain control. "You don't know what you're talking about, Seth. You're just upset because I called out your failures." But his voice was weak now, defeated, and everyone could hear it. Seth shook his head slowly, looking almost disappointed rather than angry. "My failures? Jimmy, let me tell you about failure. Failure is using your platform to attack colleagues instead of entertaining your audience. Failure is letting your personal jealousies override your professional responsibilities. Failure is forgetting that this business is supposed to be about bringing joy to people, not settling scores." He began moving toward the edge of the stage, but he wasn't done yet. "You want to know what success looks like, Jimmy? Success is building people up instead of tearing them down. Success is using your influence responsibly. Success is remembering that we're all in this together, trying to make people laugh during difficult times." The audience was completely captivated now, hanging on every word. Several people were openly recording with their phones, and you could see others frantically typing on social media. This was the kind of moment that would be replayed and analyzed for decades to come. Jimmy, his face now a mixture of rage and humiliation, made one last desperate grab for dignity. "Get out of here, Seth! Just get out!" But the words came out as more of a plea than a command, and everyone could hear the defeat in his voice. Seth paused at the edge of the stage and looked back one final time. "You know what, Jimmy? I actually feel sorry for you, because tomorrow morning you're going to wake up and realize what you've done here tonight. You're going to realize that you destroyed your own reputation for absolutely nothing." His voice softened slightly, but the impact was devastating. "And the worst part is, it didn't have to be this way." With that, Seth Meyers walked off the Jimmy Kimmel live stage for what everyone knew would be the last time. The studio erupted in confused applause, some people clapping for Seth's dignity under fire, others seemingly applauding just because they weren't sure what else to do. Jimmy stood alone behind his desk, looking like a man who had just lost everything that mattered to him. The cameras continued rolling for several more seconds, capturing Jimmy's complete emotional collapse as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. His mouth was moving, but no words were coming out. His hands were shaking visibly, and there were actual tears in his eyes as he realized that millions of people had just watched him destroy his own career in real time. Security personnel were now moving through the studio, though it was unclear whether they were there to escort anyone out or simply to manage the chaos that was sure to follow. Audience members were already streaming toward the exits, many of them still recording and posting to social media as they went. The show's band, who had been sitting in stunned silence throughout the entire confrontation, didn't even attempt to play anyone off. There was no music, no commercial break transition, no attempt to return to normal programming. The show simply ended. Within hours, footage of the confrontation was everywhere. Every major news outlet was covering the story. Entertainment. Journalists were calling it the end of Jimmy Kimmel's career. And social media was flooded with reactions ranging from shock to admiration for Seth's handling of the situation. The hashtag Team Seth was trending alongside Kimmel Meltdown, and the consensus was clear. Seth Meyers had emerged from this disaster with his reputation not just intact, but enhanced. Jimmy Kimmel's show would never recover from this moment. The man who had tried to destroy a colleague's career on live television had instead destroyed his own, and everyone who witnessed it would remember exactly where they were the night that late-night television changed forever. Seth Meyers had walked into an ambush and walked out a hero, while Jimmy Kimmel was left to face the consequences of his own cruelty.